Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Cedric Geffen. I'm the president of March of the Living Australia, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to another of our many online events planned for 2022. In 2021, we hosted close to 30 riveting online events, all related to the two core pillars of our educational mission: learning more about the Holocaust and about Israel, to ensure a better understanding of the past in order to create a better future for all going forward. And tonight's session will add to this wonderful repertoire. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we work and live, and on which this online event is being hosted today. We pay our respects to Indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. At a time when resilience and inspiration are sorely needed, the Purim holiday that has just been marks the joyous triumph of the human spirit over hatred. Today, especially, when a tyrant casts a wicked and treacherous pall over millions of innocent people, we can hopefully find inspiration from survivors and communities and individuals around the world that have in the past and are currently coming together to stand against hate, to overcome oppression, injustice, and anti-Semitism. Tonight, we have the privilege of listening to Rochy Miller as she recounts the inspirational story of her mother. Rochy is a retired medical doctor and writer. In addition to her medical qualifications, she has studied creative writing, holds both medical journalism and Master of Journalism degrees, is the author of a series of widely used textbooks in the field of aesthetics education, and has recently published her first book, Not Just a Survivor, A Portrait of My Mother, a memoir of her late mother's story. Originally from South Africa, Rochy lives in Brisbane, Australia, with her husband, for those of you who are not from Australia, with her husband, Jonathan. Rochy will begin her presentation shortly, and this will be followed by a Q&A session where we would love you to engage with the speaker. And now, without further ado, it's over to Rochy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you. I'm incredibly honored to have so many of you willing to give up your Sunday evening to spending this time with me, and so grateful to the March of the Living for providing this opportunity. Many of you have read the book. Many have heard me talk about my mother's journey before, but are nevertheless here supporting me in something that is so dear to my heart. So thank you. Each time I tell my mother's story, I'm reminded anew of how important it is to keep this memory alive and to perpetuate the messages that anti-Semitism, racism, and discrimination should not be allowed to flourish unchecked in any form, in any place, at any time. I believe it's important to repeat this message again and again until it becomes a mantra embedded in the DNA of each successive generation. And in this way, we will ensure that the Holocaust history will never be rewritten by those who say it never happened. I'm here today to talk to you about a remarkable woman, somebody whose normal life was totally decimated for the years between 22nd of June 1941, when she was incarcerated, first in the Kovna ghetto, and then in 5 concentration camps in Estonia and Germany, until she was liberated on the 15th of April 1945 from Bergen-Belsen. But what I want to focus on today is not the horror of that time, nor the terrible devastation and loss that she suffered, but the bravery, humanity, and optimism that helped her to survive and allowed her to emerge from that dark period as a whole, accomplished, and exemplary human being. somebody who went on to dedicate her life to perpetuating the memory of the Holocaust, to educating everyone she could, and to ensure the lessons of that time would never be forgotten. She was simply an incredible person who I was privileged to have as my mother. For those of you who don't know me, let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Rochy Miller. I was born in South Africa. I immigrated to Australia in 1991, where I live with my husband. I have 2 married children, one of whom lives in Australia and the other in Florida in USA. I am a retired medical doctor. I have a degree in journalism, and I've published this book about my mom about 18 months ago. Let me tell you about my mother. My mother, Lea, was born in Lithuania in 1914. From the outset, by all accounts, she was special. She was exceptionally smart, and she studied at the University of Kovna at a time when most women didn't complete high school. She had a degree in natural sciences and taught at a Hebrew high school. My mum was fluent in at least 8 languages, and she could communicate in many others. She was learned, gregarious, and a loving family member. This is a family photo of my mum as a teenager with her parents and younger siblings. They lived in Malat, which was a small town in Lithuania where her parents had a bakery and a restaurant. She also had an older brother, Jaime, who had migrated to South Africa in 1926. In 1937, she married Moses Klompus, and a year later they had a son, Michael. They lived a relatively normal family life in Kovna, which was the capital of Lithuania. In 1940, Lithuania was invaded by Russia, and there was a non-aggression pact signed between Russia and Germany. As a consequence of this document, the Lithuanian Jewry had a false sense of security, despite the impact that Germany was having in other parts of Europe. And then, on the 22nd of June, 1941, everything changed. Germany invaded Lithuania. These are her words. You can imagine, we were sitting peacefully on a Sunday, a sunny Sunday morning in June. Because Russia and Germany have a non-aggression pact and Lithuania is ruled by Russia, we think we are quite safe. But then we see at about 12 o'clock in the morning, German planes attacking Kovna. Bombs were all the time just booming. That is all that we heard. And from that very minute, we could already not get out into the street because we were straight away arrested or taken away to be shot. From this moment, all the Jews in Lithuania ceased to be normal members of the country where they'd been born, where they'd lived and worked and identified as citizens. Many of them were murdered by their Lithuanian neighbors and the German forces in the first few days of occupation. Those who survived this initial onslaught were forced into the ghetto, where every liberty was curtailed. Despite this, my mother and her husband and child and her mother-in-law remained in the ghetto as a family for 15 months, and they counted themselves lucky. They had work and they were together. Against all odds, they survived selections, hunger, brutality. And then in October 1942, the Nazi authorities issued a demand for 2,000 men from the ghetto to be sent to Estonia. The Judenrat provided a list, and my mother's husband's name was on it. There was an offer for the men's families to go with them. If they agreed, they were promised that they could continue to live together. After much agonizing, they decided to go to Estonia together as a family. But it was a cruel Nazi hoax. And as soon as they reached the station, the family was separated. My mother was sent to one concentration camp in Estonia, her husband to another, and her not quite 5-year-old son and his grandmother were sent to Auschwitz. And my mother never saw them again. My mother spent almost 3 years in 5 different concentration camps. These were Vaivara, Erida, and Lagedi, all in Estonia. And then via transfer to Stutthof in Germany, she went to a camp in Ochsenzoll, which was an offshoot of the infamous women's camp Ravensbrück, which was close to Hamburg, and finally to Bergen-Belsen. She was liberated on the 15th of April, 1945, in Bergen-Belsen by the Allied forces. These details are described in this one-page document I found, entitled The Story of My Life. It is dated the 14th of February, 1946, written 10 months after liberation, while she was living and working in Bergen-Belsen's displaced persons camp. It's interesting, it's written in English. The first concentration camp my mother was sent to was Vaivara in Estonia. After the initial devastation of being separated from her family and the incredible dehumanization and humiliation that she endured, her resilience emerged and she began to hone amazing coping skills. She explained that survival was due mostly to chance. She estimated that this accounted for perhaps 90% of survival. But the other 10%, what you did with the chance you were given, was up to you. My mum influenced that 10% with her innate strengths, and she used these skills to help others to survive as well. She was brave, she was not afraid to confront authority, and her ability to converse with her captors in their language gave her a subliminal advantage. In Vaivara, she worked in the barracks, having to clean the squalid living quarters of 100 women who shared 20 bunks and were locked in overnight with no toilet facilities. Every morning, the kappa would come to collect 60 or 70 of the women from the barracks for forced labor, and frequently he would beat them when they wouldn't comply. My mother couldn't stand this brutality, and she quickly devised a plan. She approached him and offered to organize the work groups for him on condition that he wouldn't assault the women. Then she got the women to agree to a roster system that she set up, enabling the very young and the very old not to go out to work, and ensuring that the others took turns to have a day off. And it worked. There was a compliant workforce. The most vulnerable remained in the barracks and recuperated. The camp leader took note of her skills and she earned his grudging respect, and she gained a little bargaining power. Step by step, she succeeded in taking some control of an untenable situation and making it a little better for everyone. The women who remained in the barracks each day helped with the cleaning. And my mother managed to establish a relationship with the kitchen staff, which allowed her to access coal and wood so that the barrack was a little warmer when the women returned from work and there was hot water to drink. Early on, my mother recognized the importance of connectedness. She instinctively knew that friendship and belonging helped to overcome the dehumanization that the Nazis sought to perpetrate. During her time in the camps, she gathered around her a group of about 10 younger women who became her friends. She talked about them as her girls or her adopted daughters, and they looked out for each other. They made sacrifices for each other, and they survived together. She said, we were mostly from Kovno, from Lithuania, our group. We were all the time like a whole group, always standing together. And this helped us a lot. We came from one place, so we had the same schooling. We had the Hebrew language, all of us, And whenever we had a chance, we were just sitting and telling each other stories about what we had studied or stories from home, trying not to forget who and what we are. This is a photograph of my mother and her adopted daughters, taken at Bergen-Belsen 10 months after liberation. And this photo is an incredible gift that they made for her. It's a handmade book, each page a handwritten tribute to her, presented by her girls for her birthday on the 5th of July, 1945. The cover of the book is made from a Canadian Air Force uniform, and the inside cover is adorned with Preston fabric flowers. To me, this is amazing evidence of the role she played in their lives. At this point, I'd like to tell you 3 short stories, 3 incidents that illustrate this incredible relationship. One of her girls, a teenager, was smaller and frailer than the others and struggled to make it through the 24 hours between one meager meal and the next. As the day wore on, she would faint from hunger. Any evidence of weakness was almost certain to lead to extermination. If her fainting was ever observed by the Blitzwomen or other Nazi officials, she would almost certainly have been sent to Auschwitz. My mother knew this, and she devised a plan to save her. She gathered the others in the group and arranged for each of them to retain a little of their daily ration of bread in order to give it to the girl during the course of the day and prevent her from fainting. Imagine the selflessness for someone who received watery soup and 1/10 of a loaf of bread as their only sustenance each day to give some of it away. It was a huge sacrifice, but they all complied. And because of this amazing generosity, this young girl survived. The second story that illustrates the same incredible generosity occurred when they were transferred to Stutthof, a staging point before they were moved to a new concentration camp near Hamburg. They noticed a young girl from another camp who had been pulled aside and was waiting for transportation to certain extermination. The group made a decision to try to save her. This is my mom's description. So we, the Kovner girls, got together. What were we going to do about it? We couldn't simply let her die. A Russian lady was in charge of watching the selected group of doomed inmates. She was looking after them until they were to be deported. We still had something hidden, a chain, a watch, some money. Someone had a ring. So we decided to put together a parcel. I approached this woman, I could speak Russian, and I told her what we would give her if she would take out this young girl for us. And she did. She brought me that little girl, and I paid with what we had for her. We took the child back to the barracks where we hid her, and later she became one of our girls. Chayala was her name. She wasn't so little. She was 14, but she looked like 10. Until the end of the camps, she remained with me and became my adopted daughter. The third story shows the reciprocal nature of this relationship. This is the story where my mother's life was saved by the actions of her adopted daughters. After a short time in Vivera, she became ill with typhus, and she was sent to the so-called medical facility. This in itself was a miracle, since most inmates of the camps who became ill were simply sent to Auschwitz. But she had earned the respect of the Nazi camp leader, and he ordered that she at least be given the chance to recover. There was no medical care, but there was a visit from a Jewish doctor and a nurse every day. Most people died in that facility, but my mother somehow recovered. Before she was well enough to leave the medical facility, however, the camp was closed to avoid the approaching Russian army. The staff and occupants were ordered to move to a new camp, And the patients in the medical facility, including my mother, were wrapped in their thin blankets and thrown outside onto the snow and left to die. But her friends had not forgotten her. At great personal risk, 2 of them came to find her, bringing clothes with them. They dressed her and, carrying them between her, dragged her to the place where the rest of the camp had been assembled for transfer to a new location. They slipped her into the line with the healthy inmates, supporting her as they marched in groups of 10 towards the train. One of her friends, the nurse, pushed her unseen into a train carriage filled with medical equipment and locked her in. And against all odds, thanks to their actions, she survived. Finally, after 2 more concentration camps, she landed in Bergen-Belsen. After 5 hellish weeks there, on the 15th of April, 1945, Bergen-Belsen was liberated by the Allied forces. After liberation, my mother remained in Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp for almost a year, working first as a secretary to the commanding officer of Bergen-Belsen, and later establishing and running a kosher kitchen with a few of her adopted daughters. There was relative security in the displaced persons camp. My mother had around her her support network, but she needed to start her life again. The transition was extremely difficult. Only when the inmates were free did the true scope of their loss become real. She had lost everyone and everything: her parents, her brothers and sister, her husband, her child, her mother-in-law, her friends, her home, her possessions, but she never ever lost the essence of who she was. And she retained her humanity and her morality throughout that time, and she survived. And then she went on to rebuild her life. After 10 months in the displaced persons camp, she was ready to move forward. She had traveled to Europe for a short time looking for her husband, hoping against hope that he was alive. But she eventually had to accept that he had not survived. She looked at various options for her future. There was an illegal immigration to Israel that appealed to her sense of Zionism. She had family in the United States who reached out to her, but she decided to join her older brother in South Africa. At the time, South Africa was not accepting Holocaust survivors, but she had a cousin who was an influential lawyer there, and he managed to arrange a temporary visa for her. She was the first survivor to arrive in South Africa. Shortly after arriving in South Africa, after an initial physical and mental breakdown, where she spent 3 months in hospital, her resilience resurfaced. She enrolled for university. She got a job. She rented an apartment on her own. And she met my father, who she married in April 1948, 2 years after arriving in South Africa. She went back to university and studied, attaining 4 more degrees over her lifetime, the last being a PhD in Holocaust literature at the age of 73. She had 2 daughters, my sister and me, and in time she had 5 adored grandchildren whose lives she influenced profoundly. She immigrated to Australia in 1990 and lived a full life in Sydney until she passed away in 2000 at the age of 86. Despite building a new life for herself, her fundamental identity was that of a survivor. She justified her survival and determination to live by a self-imposed obligation to share her experiences with everybody. This remained the central force in her life. After my mother passed away in 2000, I found in her apartment a remarkable collection of items, wonderful and important evidence of an incredible life. There were amazing documents from the time of her liberation from Bergen-Belsen, newspaper articles of her university achievements, photographs, writings, lecture notes, audio interviews, video interviews. She was an avid educator, taking every opportunity to talk about the Holocaust to whoever would listen. She gave countless interviews. She was a guide at the Holocaust museums in South Africa and Australia. And she was a living historian in numerous school programs. She immersed herself in Holocaust studies, trying to make logical sense of this inexplicable trauma. She truly embodied the Holocaust experience, physically, emotionally, and academically. My mother had always spoken openly about her experiences, and as her children, we were always aware of her loss, of her sad past. We absorbed her experiences through all our senses into the core of our beings. Her past, our heritage, was always chillingly there. But it was only 15 years after her death when I began to really listen to the many interviews she'd given over her life and read the documents that related not only to Holocaust experiences, but also her active involvement in Holocaust education for the remainder of her life, that I truly appreciated how exceptional she was. I became awestruck by her resilience, by her incredible belief in what was important, stunned by her sense of morality that dictated all her decision-making, and her tenacity to ensure that this dark chapter in history would never be rewritten by Holocaust denialists. And as I worked through her writings and I listened to her words, the essence of my mother crystallized. And her mission to perpetuate the memory of those who couldn't tell their stories became my mission too. And so the book, the story of my mother's amazing life and passion, was born. I guess by now you are starting to get a sense of the person my mother was. I could go on for hours telling you of her amazing attributes, of her bravery and courage, her loyalty, her coping skills, and her empathy towards other people. Her incredible sense of self, her stubborn determination to live against all odds, but always in the context of morality, never at the cost of another inmate. And her amazing pragmatism and her enduring optimism. But we've run out of time because I really want to have an opportunity to answer any questions that you may have. So let me leave you with a quote that depicts in my eyes the hero that my mother was. The amazing woman who was not just a survivor, but so much more. She said, every hour of our life, to live an extra hour under these circumstances, this was courage, this was heroism. We couldn't do anything to our murderers, to our enemies, but at least we tried to defy them by trying to want to live. Thank you.
Look, that was absolutely breathtaking. All I can say is I wish I had met your mother. And it's been an absolute honor and a pleasure. What I would love to do, what I would like to do now is to open the floor to people to submit questions or comments. So although people haven't submitted questions, if there's anyone here who wishes to ask a question or make a comment, what I suggest is that you put up your hand, because I'm sure Rochy would be more than delighted to answer any questions. So you can put your hand up at the bottom of your screen. There's a place where you can do that, or you can simply do it on the screen, or you can unmute yourself and request to make a comment. So if there's anyone out there who would like to comment, this is the time to do so. Anyone?
Hi, Rochy. It's Denise.
Hello, Denise.
Hello, my friend. Thank you so much. I guess having known your mum as well, it's amazing how you've created an opportunity to bring her to life. And so one of the things I think that's important is how do we also bring to life, this story? I mean, apart from, buying your book, which I have, how else can we get this message? And especially it's sort of such an urgent time that's going on in the world at the moment in Ukraine. It's really important. I mean, yes, we have the museum, yes, we have Courage to Care, but as individuals, what do you see that is one thing that could actually raise awareness?
I guess we just need to talk. We need to tell the story. We need to make sure that we don't miss an opportunity to acknowledge that things happened and that there is good as well as bad, and that we need to focus on the good and never ever forget what happened. And I guess that's really the most important thing, and to make it relevant to today, because it is relevant to today.
Rochy, there's a question from Rob Schneider, and that is, first of all, thanking you for sharing your mom's story. The question about whether or not you cover her life in South Africa in the book as well.
Yes, I do. I mean, because half of her adult life was in South Africa. So the book is actually, it was important to me not to just have her Holocaust stories. She was such a rounded person, and it was really important to me that I presented all of her, or all of her that I could. And so the book has kind of got little bits of her quirks, a lot of bits about her children, her grandchildren have written little bits. It's really just trying to present her as the whole person, not just her Holocaust experiences.
Des, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Rochy. I haven't seen you since you were about 5 years old, I think.
I think I've changed a little since then.
And I don't know if you remember me, but I went through all my schooling with Sheila, and had many a lovely meal made by your mother. I haven't read the book, but I intend to. So my question is, in terms of her life in South Africa, post going through the terrible years that she did during the Holocaust. If I think about it in terms of myself, I mean, being the child of two South African-born parents, we had no clue, no understanding whatsoever, and probably were more deterred by the survivors' accents than anything else. So therefore, couldn't attribute to your mother and others what was rightfully theirs. How did your mum feel about the fact of recognition by the South African Jewish community in whose midst she lived in that kind of light?
I think my mum was particularly thick-skinned, to be honest. But she also had a very strong sense of self. Her time in South Africa was spent studying. My mum studied as a way of dealing with the Holocaust. She studied as a way of escaping from what had happened in her past. But she was always grounded in terms of community involvement with the Holocaust. So she educated at the schools, she educated, I don't think she felt alienated by the community at all, but she was different. And she knew she was different. But, South Africa had quite a big ex-Lithuanian community. So there was a lot of Jewish Lithuanians, not all of them post-Holocaust, but many of them post-Holocaust. and they had a community kinship. And she devoted her life to that community kinship. I think that was part of her coping skills.
Excellent. The next question is, or comment is from Alvin Blumenthal.
Hi, Rochy. Thank you very, very much for your truly remarkable synopsis of your mother's life. I don't know if you know who I am, but I'm the guy who used to come to your house in 1968 and 67 and 68. And your mother used to teach me 2 or 3 times a week at night. I want to, and on Sunday mornings, I want to just bring to the attention of the participants and maybe even to you, your mother's attitude to teaching me Hebrew for matric or HSC. You spoke about her selflessness, about her saving food for her adopted friends and people with her in the ghetto and in the concentration camps. I was studying for matric. I had 2 years to go when my teacher passed away. My parents we came from a small town, as you did, and we didn't know what to do. My mother, who knew your mother very, very well, my mother also being a Holocaust survivor, my mother approached your mom and asked her, would she consider taking me on as a student to put me through matric for the subject of Hebrew. Your mother's first reaction was, yes, I do have the knowledge and I do have the capability, but I don't have the time. I have 2 daughters, I have a husband, we have a business, I'm studying, I have a house to run, and I'll find it very, very difficult to put one single student through his matric for Hebrew. The next week, your mother contacted my parents and said she's rethought the issue, and she finds it incumbent on her. She finds it's her duty to impart and to spread and to share her knowledge of Hebrew and to teach it even to one person. She took me on for 1.5 years. I used to travel to your house in Benoni twice a week at night, sometimes 3 times a week. And on Sunday mornings, I remember you in the background. You were a little girl. We're talking of 53 years ago. That was the last time I saw you. And your older sister and the Israeli guy who came onto the scene on Sunday mornings. I used to see him pottering around in the garden, being your brother-in-law. So I just want to comment on your mother's amazing attitude to education and to imparting and to sharing her amazing knowledge of the Hebrew language. And she's when I arrived in Sydney in 1996, one of the first people I went to visit was Lea Leibowitz. She became very, very close to me, and I just find it's an amazing attitude that she had. In spite of having a family, husband, daughters, business, education, and whatever else interested her in her life, she found the time for 2 hours, 3 times a week to teach me successfully through my matric Hebrew study. So I just want everyone to know that, and thanks for the time.
Thanks for sharing.
Thank you, Alvin. That's a wonderful tribute. Are there any other people who would like to comment or ask questions from Rochy? If not, I've got a question, so I'm going to give the audience the opportunity to go first. So if there's anyone there, just put your hand up or let me know via the chat that you would like to mention something. I don't see anybody. Yes, I do. Delwyn, please unmute yourself. There you go.
Thank you.
Hi.
Is it for me to speak now?
Yes, Delwyn, go ahead.
Right, thank you. Hi, Rochy.
Yeah.
I never cease to feel inspired by the story of your mother, having read the book and having heard you. But I just want to reflect on a movie that I happened to see last night. I took a couple of my non-Jewish friends. It was at the Jewish Film Festival. to see the story of Simone Weiss. I don't know, Simone Weil.
Wow.
Yes. And through the movie, I thought a lot of your mother, actually. I don't know if you're familiar with this woman. She was a French woman who went through the Holocaust and experienced a number of concentration camps and was brutalized and lost a lot of family members and came out of it with the most amazingly compassionate and fighting spirit to be a supporter of any groups of people that were victims or downtrodden, and she made it her life's mission to fight for a number of groups, starting off with people in prison in France, and then Algeria and AIDS victims, and just her whole life after the Holocaust was driven by this enormous need to help people, Jewish, non-Jewish, whoever, with extreme compassion. And it seems to be something that is often repeated, of people who survived the Holocaust to come out with, I suppose, in some ways, that if they had the strength to survive, they had the strength to go on and fully live an incredibly productive, compassionate life, like your mother and like this woman we saw last night in this movie. It's not a question, it's just a comment, an observation.
Thank you, Del. I think for my mom, she never wanted the life that had been saved to be wasted in any way. So whatever she did, it was always to make sure that her life, which had been saved when so many other people's hadn't, had to be meaningful. And I think maybe that's a driving force for many of the survivors.
Yeah, fantastic. I've got two more questions from the audience. Ian Kharif first.
Okay, thank you. Just a comment. Lea was my aunt, and we were very privileged to have spent many years and time with her. And maybe a comment or an addition to one of the questions that was asked, in addition to all the things that were said in terms of what we can do in terms of support for Holocaust related organizations and education, I think the other side is to always stand up for Israel. Lea was an ardent Zionist. She loved Israel. And I think if all Jews supported Israel and supported what Israel stands for and the true value of Israel, she would be proud of that.
Thanks, Ian. I've got a question from, I can only see Bach G, but I'm not sure what that stands for, but go ahead.
Hi, yeah, my name is Howard, and I'm actually the husband of Gail, who is the daughter of Hami, who was, as I know her, Auntie Leah's brother. So, hi, Rochy, all good? I just want to say there's a totally different side of, as I know her, Auntie Leah, because I've kind of known to do the odd little prank and joke and be a bit of a smart-ass wise guy, and she could take as good as she could give, as get. So anytime I would do a little joke or prank, she always had a smart, witty comeback and sharp and quick as anything. So there was this real jovial, light-hearted, beautiful side to her, which this is what encapsulated, her essence to me. And Rochy, the way you've just portrayed her, and it's just exactly how we remember her, and just what a beautiful soul, and shkayach to you for what you've done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rochy, if I may, or the audience, I'm going to just make a point here, and that is, and I'm not sure what percentage of the audience is from Lithuanian heritage. A lot is obviously spoken about Polish survivors, etc., or survivors from many other countries, Hungary, and sometimes the survivors from Lithuania and the story of the Lithuanian Holocaust is sometimes not as well read or not that well known. And here is a story, an exemplary story of an exemplary person, and it is fantastic, Rochy, that you've documented this. And I think it will go a long way to telling the story about survivors from Lithuania, because I don't think it's quite as obvious to the general audience, the story of the Lithuanian Holocaust. So thank you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, like all good things, tonight's presentation comes to an end. This discussion could have carried on for much longer. So on behalf of all of you, I would like to thank Rochy for her enthralling and heartwarming presentation and wonderful delivery, by the way, Rochy. I congratulate you on that. Thank you. And I certainly will be going out there to buy the book, and I suggest that everybody else does so too. And before we end off, I just want to invite you all to make a note of our next event, which will take place on Thursday, the 7th of April at 7:30 p.m., where Eva Zeleznikov, the granddaughter of the ex-owners of Scheherazade, an institution for the survivor community in Melbourne for decades, will talk about her commitment as a third-generation descendant of survivors to Holocaust memorialization and education, and we'll talk about the fascinating topic of choiceless choices as experienced in the Wittenberg affair in Ghetto Vilna. Again, a Lithuanian story. So thank you all for participating. Thank you, Rochy. I hope you found that of interest, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon, and have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.